Today is the 70th anniversary of the United States dropping an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki for the end of World War II. The weapon, nicknamed Fat Man, was released at 11:01 a.m. local time, causing tens of thousands of civilian casualties. The even more devastating bombing of Hiroshima happened 3 days earlier. This anniversary of the only time to date that atomic bombs have been used in warfare comes at a time when headlines are being made worldwide about the proposed Iran nuclear deal. As a child of the 80s, I can remember, as can some of you likely, those duck and cover drills which we practiced of hiding under desks in case there was a nuclear attack while we were at school. Did anyone else ever think that that was a stupid and fruitless exercise to hide under a desk in case of nuclear attack? And it would be if you were at ground zero of that atomic mushroom. But my understanding is the value of this exercise, beyond giving people something to do other than panic, is to protect people legitimately who were quite many miles away from the blast site from windows imploding. That was actually the actual concrete benefit of having people under desks for windows that would explode tens, if not hundreds, of miles away. Accordingly, there are strong arguments to be made that nuclear non-proliferation, securing loose nuclear weapons, and decreasing the total number of nuclear weapons in the world remains one of the most pressing ethical and human rights issues of our time. But today is also the one-year anniversary of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, after which his body lay in the street for 5 hours. That helped galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement. Both of these anniversaries call us to remember and to rededicate ourselves to the work of peace and justice. And the confluence of these two significant dates, I would like to invite us to reflect some on all the different bifurcating directions in which we can feel pulled to lend our time, our energy, and our financial resources, all of which are limited and finite. Either nuclear weapons or systemic racism alone is more than enough to dominate our attention and the attention of the general public and policymakers. Then there is the looming threat of global climate change, or to review the UUA's congregation-wide study action initiatives. We name a new one every 2 years and then focus on it for 4 years, so they overlap. And those themselves were winnowed down from many different competing options. To name just those that we use have been called to bring our full attention and action to in just the last decade are escalating inequality, reproductive justice, immigration as a moral issue, ethical eating, and creating peace. You can likely add other items that may be your highest priorities for peace and justice and human dignity in this world. And such litanies of the world's problems can lead good-hearted people to just throw up our hands in despair and in compassion fatigue, which just strengthens the status quo. Or as the activist Howard Zinn used to say, you can't stay neutral on a moving train. We are on a train moving through time. The status quo is unjust, and to do nothing is to just support it. And various advocacy groups can often end up competing with one another for our attention and our money, rather than working in coalition. So I'd like to invite us to take a step back from the immediacy of seeking solutions and explore if there might be tools that can help us for navigating all these legitimate concerns that are also conflicting. In particular, I'd like to invite us to explore insights from what is called intersectionality theory, as well as insights from the movement for collective liberation. To begin with some historical context, if you go back to the second wave feminism in the 1960s, in which a lot of the leadership and focus was on white women, Black women and lesbians began to advocate for ways in the midst of second-wave feminism for the ways in which the struggles of black women are different from the struggles of white women, and sometimes that movement is called womanism to distinguish it from feminism. As well as you began to hear about the ways that the struggles of lesbians were different from the struggles of heterosexual women, whether white or black or other. One influential turning point was the Combahee River Collective Statement of 1977. Now, I know you all read that in high school, right? That you didn't is part of the problem. It was written by black lesbians about and out of their experience. And the conversation continued to expand to consider the differences of non-Western women and their struggles, of Latina and Chicana women, of Asian women, and women with disabilities, and we could go on. A little more than a decade later, in 1989, the legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality as a metaphor for developing critical theory around these burgeoning ethical struggles around difference. She said, consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens at an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a black woman, let's call her Sandra Bland, is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination, race discrimination, or in most cases, both. In some ways, this point can seem obvious in retrospect, but I will say, as a white dude raised as a conservative Christian from the South, it was a revelation to me when I started reading the writings of black lesbian activists like Audre Lorde in her book, Sister Outsider. And I began to consider what the experience of the world is of someone who daily experiences the triple oppressions of racism, sexism, and heterosexism. Perhaps most importantly, intersectional theory challenges us to move from the level of individual prejudice to seeing the ways that racism, sexism, and heterosexism, etc., are embedded in the systems and structures and institutions of our society and must be addressed at the systemic level. If any of you subscribe to The New Yorker or want to look this up, there was an interview with Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Michael Brown in the most recent issue of The New Yorker. And it's a great example of a lack of intersectional theory. That it's all about his lack of personal prejudice and total obliviousness to the fact that he's embedded in a deeply racist and sexist system, and that the laws are unjust. And so it's a great example of that. I may say more about that in a future sermon. So I explored some of this intersectional dynamic previously in a sermon titled Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. Some of you may remember President Obama in his second inaugural address name-checked those three watershed moments. As you may well know, Seneca Falls is a city in New York. I'll say I almost didn't know. I knew about Selma growing up in South Carolina, but I was not taught about Seneca Falls. I was not taught about Stonewall growing up as a child in South Carolina in the public school system. So as you may or may not know, depending on where you grew up, Seneca Falls is a city in New York that was the site of an important early women's rights convention in 1848. Selma is a city in Alabama that was the beginning of three important protest marches that many UUs showed up for in 1965 for African American voting rights. These nonviolent marchers were met with violent, brutal, and bloody opposition, particularly at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And Stonewall is the Greenwich Village Bar in New York City, where in 1969, members of the LGBT community rose up against the injustice of weekly police raids and launched the modern fight for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights in the U.S. And in recent history, there's significant examples of oppressed groups choosing coalition over competition, such as in 1970, when Huey Newton, the African-American co-founder of the Black Panthers, said, "When we have revolutionary conferences, rallies, and demonstrations, there should be full participation of the gay liberation movement and the women's liberation movement. We need to work together." But there are also times when the civil rights movement was sexist, when the women's rights movement was heterosexist, or various combinations thereof. For example, at a historic meeting in which Dr. King spoke resounding, prophetic words that sounded throughout history in the wake of Rosa Parks' arrest, a number of other African-American men spoke. And Rosa Parks was recognized, but she was not invited to speak, nor were any other women. As one biographer noted, it was a male-dominated movement. Similarly, in the decades before Stonewall, Bayard Rustin, a longtime advisor and mentor in nonviolent thinking to Martin Luther King Jr., he was a gay black man responsible for several major successes of the civil rights movement. Rustin was deeply involved in the planning of the Montgomery bus boycott and then became the chief organizer of the March on Washington, for which he was featured on the cover of Life in September 1963. But at the same time that Martin Luther King Jr. was writing to white moderates about why we can't wait in regard to racial justice, King was telling Rustin privately that gay rights had to wait for racial justice to come first. Ironically, at the same time, Paul Murray, the first African-American female Episcopal priest and a closeted lesbian, chastised Rustin and others for their exclusion of black women from the March on Washington's speaker list. Similarly, Seneca Falls, that landmark 19th century convention of feminists, was also a gathering in which black women were conspicuously absent. Or as Sojourner Truth famously said, and the speech was given in a Universalist congregation, "Ain't I a woman? If you cut me, do I not bleed?" Consider just two more brief examples. Founder of the National Organization of Women, Betty Friedan, her anti-lesbian sentiments were so pronounced and now that a group of lesbians in protest formed the Lavender Menace. And often the way the story of the Stonewall riots has been told has covered up that transgender activists played a major role in leading those riots at the Stonewall Inn, a bias that is sometimes called cis-washing Stonewall. So the opposite of transgender is cisgender, so cis-washing Stonewall. Intersectionality tries to learn from these lessons of history, both positive and negative, to help shift our attention from competing oppressions to building coalitions. The unjust status quo benefits from keeping oppressed groups divided against one another. In regard to building coalitions, intersectionality can be seen as an attempt to respond to an essay by Audre Lorde titled, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." The Master's tools will never dismantle the Master's house. Intersectionality is trying to be a new tool that not get divided into class first, or race first, or gender first, or sexuality first, or disability first factions. Reality is much messier and much more complicated than single issues in isolation, and so too must be our work for peace and justice, if it is truly to move us toward our sixth UU principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Perhaps at minimum, what that goal might mean is, to be specific, it might mean a simple, decent place to live for every human being. That's the motto of Habitat for Humanity. It would mean healthy food, dynamic education, meaningful work, accessible health care, and an infrastructure that serves all ages and all abilities. And to speak just a little bit more about what is this master's house that must be dismantled to build a new way, Bell Hooks, for one, bluntly says that what justice-loving people are called to dismantle is the white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. Importantly, that term phrase, which is a bit of a mouthful to say, I'll admit, is parallel to what Dr. King called the three greatest threats to building the beloved community. So he names, what is your dream, Dr. King? It's building the beloved community. But he said, it's not just about that positive goal, it's about naming what are the greatest threats to us ever getting there. And he said the three greatest threats are racism. And so Bell Hooks is just saying, well, what racism means is you're dismantling white supremacy. Materialism is the second greatest threat to the beloved community, according to Dr. King. That's what Hooks calls capitalism, and what she's especially meaning is that extreme form of capitalism that only cares about increasing the bottom line of profit alone, often at the expense of exploiting people and planet. And the third greatest threat to building the beloved community is militarism, extreme militarism related to what Hooks calls patriarchy, domination by force, usually by a male hierarchy. So like that race, class, gender, sexuality, ability of intersectionality, these triple threats to building the beloved community are also interlocking, mutually reinforcing oppressions. To approach this subject from another perspective and to share a little bit about where I find myself in these struggles, suffice it to say, in the theologically conservative congregation of my childhood, I did not really hear much about dismantling the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Instead, the focus was much less on solving the social problems of the world and much more on saving people's soul for the next world. Or as one of my professors used to say, who grew up in an African-American congregation, he said, "I don't want a pie in the sky by and by. I want some ham where I am." But the message I received as a child was that the world would be a better place if all of our Southern Baptist missionaries were successful, and all the world became not merely Christian, but specifically Southern Baptist, the best flavor of Christian, right? Really the only legitimate flavor, let's just be clear. I also grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh, one of those personifications. If you're wondering, what is this abstract white supremacist capitalist patriarchy? It's Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
That's what it is. There's a joke I can tell, but I won't say it. Now, when I first... which may disappoint you. No, so the joke is to think about the ways that we get divided and hold on to grudges. There's a joke about a man who was stranded on an island, and he was finally saved after almost 10 years. And then he was kind of showing the people around the island, and they said, "So, what do you, what did you do while you were here?" And he was kind of showing them around, and they found 3 different huts. They weren't really that far apart on this beachfront. And they said, why 3 huts? You're just one guy, right? He said, "Well, this is where I sleep, and this is where I worship." I kind of wanted a separation between the two to have something, kind of a division of the sacred and the profane. And they said, "Well, why the third one?" And he said, "Oh, I don't like to talk about that. That's where I used to go to church." So we get divided in these weird ways. So when I first became involved with anti-racist work, part of my reaction, and some of you may be able to identify with this, was sort of classic white liberal guilt. But as I learned about white privilege contrasted with the racism people of color face daily, or like that triple oppression that I mentioned earlier, that Audre Lorde and other black lesbians face, of that triple oppression, of the intersection of race and sexism and heterosexism. But over time I came to see that guilt just makes you feel bad individually, and it does nothing to really advance the struggle for liberation. Though it can be an opening point for just realizing that things need to change so that it can be the value of its temporary. And I think the real turning point for me was the insight that loss of privilege is not the same as reverse discrimination. That my loss of male privilege and white privilege and heterosexual privilege, that is not the same. It's a loss. It's a real loss. You may mourn that loss. It's legitimate to mourn any loss, but it's not the same as reverse discrimination. And as I continue to move into the struggle for collective liberation, my motivation is not to alleviate white guilt, because you won't get very far. That's not very much of a motivation, and it's likely to just leave you resentful. Rather, I've come to find that advocating for justice is intrinsically rewarding. I've come to find my own humanity deepened and expanded through celebrating diversity, not tolerating diversity, but celebrating diversity in the way my humanity is deepened by being in relationship with people who are not like me. And I found a deep beauty in having my heart opened in compassion and connection, not just for people who are most naturally part of my tribe, whatever that means, but for all of humanity. That's what it means to existentially experience our seventh UU principle, the interdependent web of all existence. In contrast, to consider recent headlines here in Frederick County over whether to repeal an English-only ordinance passed in 2012, let me speak for myself as someone who recently bought a house in downtown Frederick, in saying that I didn't buy a house in Frederick to be part of building a community that is xenophobic and seeking to re-entrench the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. I bought a house in Frederick to be part of a community that celebrates diversity, that embraces freedom, and that extends hospitality to all. I'll restrain myself from listing all the ways historically that the United States has never been an English-only country. Instead, let me say that the lessons of intersectionality and collective liberation, as well as logic and science, tell us that diversity is essential for a healthy ecosystem, and that monocultures tend to feed on themselves and to be unhealthy and become extinct. Also, we know that more than one language is good for your brain. If we want to compete globally, perhaps what we should ban is people trying to limit themselves, and especially really trying to limit other people to English only. That's the wrong direction. Instead, one reason I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister is that I think being a big tent congregation that draws wisdom from 6 diverse sources is essential for making sense of a globalized, pluralistic 21st century world, the world in which we find ourselves. The opposite of that alive, engaged, connected feeling of being part and deeply connected to that interdependent web of all existence is a fear-based, isolated individualism of only male voices, speaking only in English, and in which the only way to solve problems is through violence and domination. To give you my armchair diagnosis of the American psyche, it is no coincidence that Donald Trump continues to be popular among a minority of voters, despite all the incredibly racist and sexist things he says. He is another literal personification of the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, desperately trying to resist change in a changing world. But in the words of one intersectional theorist, difference is just another word for being human. Difference is just another word for being human. And when we repress our difference, we deny our humanity and we deny the humanity of others. So as someone who was born into the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, I would add that from within that worldview, I can tell you firsthand that there's actually so much pressure to fit in, to repress difference, and to conform. It's a lot more fun over here at the intersection of collective liberation. There's so much more to say, but to briefly address some next steps, if you're saying, where do we go from here? I'll share some, these are adapted from Chris Crass, is a longtime activist. He's written about 20 best practices he has learned in his work for collective liberation. You can look these up, or I'll share all of them with you. I'll share just excerpts around 5 of them this morning. He writes, read female activist writers. Audre Lorde, Gloria Amzil-Dua, Suzanne Farr, Angela Davis, Barbara Smith, Elizabeth Batista Martinez. Study social movements and organizing experiences that are led by women, from Ida B. Wells to Abby Kelly to Septima Clark to Aja Nahu. So what does it mean that, you can think to yourself, how many of those can you say off the top of your head? Fill in a short, who is this person? What does it mean that these stories aren't household names? What it means is that our curriculum and our movies and all of that they're shaped deeply by the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. That we aren't being assigned, by and large, to read people of color, the poor, gender non-conforming writers, women, that we're not, and what they had to say for themselves about how the world might change. And I would say I'm fairly familiar with about half of those names that I mentioned, and I'm not familiar with the other half, except very cursorily. But the reason I am is that, I had a professor who, so when I took, Jesus and the Gospels, it was taught by a feminist woman, and she made me reconsider Jesus and the Christian tradition from a feminist perspective. That when I was in seminary, I took a class in womanist theology and was challenged to reconsider the theological tradition from the perspective of black women. That I took Christian history from a Latina feminist who challenged me to re-see U.S. history and Christian history from the perspective of Latina feminist and Universalist writers. Then when I took ethics, it was taught by an African-American male and challenged me to read 600 pages of Dr. King's writings and really think about African-American experience in social ethics. So the third is to learn about the current struggles in your community. Look for opportunities to get involved and support these efforts. And it's important to support and respect the existing leadership in these struggles, so those of you who are white don't go in as the great white hope. 4, practice noticing who's in the room at meetings and events. How many women are there? How many transgender people? How many people of color? How many people of different class backgrounds? Which might not always be obvious, which begs the question of, why don't you go to coffee with someone that you're in the room with and find out more about what differences there are in their life and what you might be able to learn from them. And if you're not in the room with many women or transgender people or people of color or people of different class backgrounds, maybe you need to find some different rooms and different meetings to be a part of. And finally, be aware of the ways that you might think that you are always needed. Crass writes, struggle with the saying that you'll be needed in the movement for collective liberation when you realize that you are not needed in the movement. You'll be needed in the movement for collective liberation when you realize that you're not needed in the movement, so that you can go into it in a place of collaboration and humility, that in addition to leading, you're willing to follow, especially people of color, people of different sexualities and class oppressions that have a better idea of how you might fight the current system without just recreating it, which is usually what happens. So as you continue to reflect on where you find yourself in the midst of potentially dismantling the master's house and looking for new tools and entering into solidarity with oppressed people, I invite you to rise and embody your spirit. Turn in your teal hymnals to page 1028, The Fire of Commitment.